Hi, my name is China Amy, and today I'm going to do my ESOL reflection of my experience in the classroom for week 13 assignment, the interview, the teacher, ESOL teacher reflections. So first I'm beginning with the type of ELLs I have in my class. Right now, I'm at a school that's not considered, in Fulton County, we have schools that are considered ESOL schools, and my school in particular is not an ESOL school. So oftentimes the students that are English language learners end up being placed in special needs classes, even though I have noticed through my experience that a lot of them are not struggling academically based on their knowledge of the actual content, but it's the language barrier and obstacles that make it challenging for them, which may present the situation as if they don't know what they're learning. That's what I'm learning. But right now I have two types. I have two ELL learners in my class. Two students. One came from Africa, and after she moved from Africa, she attended 1 year of school in Africa, then moved with her family to China. So I believe she completed kindergarten in Africa, and when she got to China, they placed her back inside of a kindergarten class or equivalent to kindergarten class in China, and she struggled with the language there. So being that she was from Africa, but she wasn't of an age where her language had fully developed, mostly around the time of 8 years old, you have truly developed the ability to pronunciate a lot of the letter sounds and a lot of different words in your country. So the fact that she moved from her first country to the second country in such a short time span, that I noticed that she really hadn't had a strong foundation of any language. So she would actually, when she came to Georgia in the United States, they placed her in a grade based on her age. And at the age, she should have been in the second grade class. When she got in the second grade class, we have levels of reading, guided reading levels, and she was a pre-A. So that means that she wasn't able to read any English words. And being that the English language is a polyglot, it's difficult if she didn't have that phonemic foundation or platform with the phonics instruction, because a lot of the words that we have, like our high frequency words and sight words in particular, you can't pronounce those words. Even if you know the sounds that may, like if you learned the basic letter sounds, a lot of our phonics pattern breaks those sound rules. And if you hadn't been taught that explicitly or been around it where you can hear people read it and just develop a memory of the words, you oftentimes struggle. So I am a first grade teacher. So after she was entered into the second grade classroom, she spent her first semester in second grade. And when they noticed that it was difficult to keep her on the pace of the second graders because she did not have that phonics from kindergarten and first grade, or the basic reading as emerging reader, the instruction that you would get in a kindergarten or first grade class, they demoted her in the middle of the school year, which was kind of confusing to me. But she entered my class in January, and being that we had to end for the coronavirus, that she didn't really get that much time in my classroom either. But during that time, I was able to go back to the phonics pattern, because in first grade, a lot of kids do get pushed ahead, even if they don't have the basic knowledge of reading or if they can't even read. So she was mostly in my lower group, and just like the other ELL student that I had, he had a better knowledge because he stayed in one country. So he was from Africa. So he spent all of his time in Africa, and then finally came to the United States and was learning English, but they were completely two separate students. Like their situation is very different. So once the first student in particular, she didn't have a strong foundation of almost any language because she moved so much. And I had a second student that was so strong in his actual language that sometimes even through conversations, he would transition back into his native language, which would sometimes confuse me. And I have to let him know, like, hey, I can't understand you. You have to speak English. And he'll say, oh, yeah. So, for a future, well, being that I am in this program now, a lot of things I was learning inside of my classroom, inside of the course, I was able to use inside my classroom, like a lot of the readings, because coming out of undergrad, I was just a general education teacher and general education certified and special education certified. So I had a knowledge of students with learning disabilities, but I had to learn through this experience that English language learners do not have a learning disability. They just have a obstacle with their language. So any advice that I would have for my teacher, any teacher that's getting one of those students in their classroom. If you're in a lower primary grade, like first grade, I would suggest placing them in a group with your emergent readers, because a lot of them, even though they had a strong understanding of the English language because that was their primary language, it still took them more time to develop an understanding of the phonemic sounds and, digraphs and blends and vowel teeth, diphthongs, like silent letters. It was so much that they still didn't understand. So I started to see success when I placed my 2 English language learners in that group, even though I didn't have an actual background on the ELL, like the ESOL students. I noticed that when I placed them in a group, because with the group, my lower group, we would do a lot of things with Elkonin boxes where I would give them a word, like a basic CBC word, like cat, and they would slide the pieces up like at. And even though for my students that already knew English, they were still developing the understanding of the different sounds of each letter. And for my students that were not English students, that were still learning English, I felt like they had a lot of success being at that small, broken down phase of the language. And as I reflect on my linguistic knowledge and knowledge about language, like I said, I noticed a lot of students were not struggling with the content, but they were struggling with the language. So what I did learn is that I had to find different ways for them to express their understanding. And even being that I taught first grade, even putting an emphasis on the basic vocabulary of every day. Like my first graders, they already know English, but it was still the grade where you're teaching them how to construct a sentence and how to communicate effectively using the right subject-verb agreement to understand the vocabulary. Because in first grade, it's a big emphasis on understanding vocabulary, not big academic vocabulary words, but actual basic vocabulary of everyday English language. So I noticed that a lot of things that I would have originally just assumed that my first graders would know, I would bypass, like something that I thought they would have learned in their everyday life. I had to put a strong emphasis on it, and I noticed that with doing that to help my ELL students, I was inadvertently helping all of the students in my class, because I was not just assuming that they knew the basic vocabulary and how to construct the sentence and how to communicate with proper English. I had to teach it to them, and I noticed that when my students started to catch on, they would even encourage or sometimes help my ELL students. So one student in particular, he struggled with pronouns. So he would identify girls as a he and boys as a she. And my students, because I would focus so much on making sure they understood pronouns, they would correct my students or help them and say, hey, let me show you how we do this. So I noticed that when I took the time to make sure that they understood it, the ELL students were learning as my students, regular English students, were learning. As I reflect on my approaches in the classroom and why they were chosen, I felt like I chose those strategies and those approaches because I wanted to ensure that not only was my ELL students learning, but the actual students in my classroom were learning. So I am at a predominantly African-American school, which consists of about 98% of my students are African-American. Even though they were not ELL students still learning English, Ebonics was a struggle. So I pretty much treated every student in the classroom as if they were still learning the English language and not assuming that they already knew a lot of words. Because if they are speaking how or writing how they learn to speak around being around their family, Ebonics would be their primary language, and they would speak English incorrectly. Like they would use incorrect subject-verb agreement. Slang was an issue as well. And I just treated my entire classroom as if they were English language learners. And I felt like that had a big impact on my students, because I noticed that even their comprehension of reading and the text increased. So at the beginning of the school year, I had a lot of students that were on a lower reading level. Even though they could read, they didn't comprehend what they were reading, and especially the central message, because figurative language was an issue, and understanding of the English grammar